Hey everyone, welcome to the Cogwerx Workshop podcast. I'm your host, BIOS Update, and you can think of this series as basically an extension to my typical scripted stuff. In these videos, I'm going to be expanding on the topics covered in my previous video, as well as answer viewer questions that you may have had on the previous video. These episodes are going to come out a couple weeks after each of my scripted videos. In our very first episode, we're covering even more things you need to know about tempo. If you like the content that I make and you want to see your questions highlighted on the show, you can help the channel out as a Golden Cog supporter on YouTube or a patron over on Patreon. With the introductions out of the way, let's get into the viewer questions. Our first one is from the Iron Maiden, who said, "Amazing video, but you forgot that Vynnset is the most powerful tempo hero in the game." I do agree that Vynnset is a pretty powerful tempo hero for a number of reasons. First, I don't think that tempo heroes are just guardians, rangers, and assassins, and it's also not just limited to on hits. I think a tempo hero is any hero that can reduce the value of the opponent's hand by forcing them to block or providing these deleterious on hits. If we look at Vynnset's ability, you see that she has this part where she can play a shadow non-attack action card and pay a life to basically ensure that she deals damage to her opponent. Also, when you look at her weapon, Flail of Agony, she's essentially trading life rather than cards from hand in order to deal damage and threatening a rune chant on hit, basically asking the opponent, is one of my life points worth at least one of your cards to prevent one physical damage, and then creating a rune chant on the back end. And I think also when we look at Runeblade cards, you see defense reactions like Sigil of Suffering that I think act as really strong tempo tools, especially when the opponent is at low life totals, basically saying, you can't tap out of resources, otherwise you're going to take lethal damage from Sigil of Suffering, kind of like what Wizards do with Stormstriders. And so with that all laid out, I do think that Vynnset is a pretty strong tempo hero, and I think that those components make her a very strong tempo hero. Also, if we look at rune chants, the combination of applying both physical and arcane damage makes it really difficult for opponents to block, which I think gives her an edge. Also, I think the rune gate ability is really powerful in helping her to play this more tempo-oriented strategy. I pulled up an example of what I think would be a Snatch and what I would think would be a CNC for her. So I think Deathly Wail would be a Snatch, basically accelerating her own game plan. So creating rune chants for each hero who's lost life this turn, especially if she combines that with a shadow non-attack action and paying a life, allowing her to create 2 rune chants and essentially enabling the majority of her rune gate attacks on the following turn. Whereas she also has access to Command and Conquer type cards with Widespread Destruction, which banishes cards from Arsenal. She has these tools that allow her to basically play this flexible tempo game plan, where against fast heroes, she's able to slow them down with her disruption, whereas against slower heroes, she's still able to close out the game with cards like Machinations of Dominion, her setting up wide turns of Shadow Puppetry, etc. The other thing that I want to talk about is Nazareth the Soul Harrower. And one of the things that I didn't really talk about in my video, which I do think is important to mention now, is the fact that allies are really good tempo tools in Flesh and Blood. And the reason that is that if you think about classes that are limited in action points, like Guardian, for instance, they have to give up their one action point in the turn unless they have tech cards in order to try to get around that. Even against go wide heroes, they're probably going to have to give at least 1 to 2 cards in order to take it down, which gives you extra breathing room every single time you're attacking with your ally, or every time your opponent has to target the ally instead of you. You're essentially gaining breathing room in order to enact your strategy. In one way, it's preventing you from having to use your hand to block, almost in a way that like equipment is used. Instead of having to give up equipment blocks or cards from hand to protect your life total, all of that damage is going towards the ally instead. One of the things that is interesting about allies is the fact that they basically steal tempo by making your opponents play suboptimally. It's also one of those things where the more turns that the allies are out and on the board, the more value that you're able to get from it. With that being said, that's kind of how, really just kind of touching on a couple of the things that make Vynnset a really powerful tempo hero. But when you combine all these tools, that definitely fits the role of, somewhere between a rushdown hero and a control hero. Every single class has such a range of different playstyles. And I think that actually goes into another question that I had, which was from Top At King. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. They said, would you agree that the ice talent also inherently puts a hero of an otherwise non-tempo archetype in there, as seen with Icelander? And they say the other ice heroes are within the 3 main tempo classes already, being, Ice Guardian, Ice Ranger. And I would say absolutely. I think when we look at, Lexi, Oldhim, and Jarl, if you look at their abilities, you can kind of see what components they're getting from the ice talent. So with Lexi, for instance, you see that if you turn a face down arsenal card face up and it's ice, you create a frostbite token under the hero's control. Whereas with Oldhim, you see the ice flavor with his defense reaction, where if you pitch an ice card, the attacking hero actually puts a card from their hand on the top of their deck, which fits into the ice flavor. And then with Jarl, playing that kind of armor destruction plan of trying to wear down the opponent's armor, and then every time you play an ice card in a turn, you put a frostbite token in an exposed head, chest, arms, or leg zone. So adding on to that ice talent, basically frostbiting the opponents once they've lost their equipment. And so I think when we look at the ice talent, there's a number of things that I think apply to the tempo component of Flesh and Blood. I think tempo is all about preventing your opponent from being able to do what they want to do. And the ice talent has a lot of things that prevent your opponents from being able to do that. So the first is the resource access. Ice really taxes your opponent's resources. First with Frostbites, where you're making your opponent's cards cost more. You have cards like Winter's Bite, where in red, you're telling your opponent to give you 3 resources or discard a card. And then on the Go Again axis, you have cards like Blizzard that say, if you want to keep your attack with Go Again, you need to pay 2 resources. And so preventing your opponent from going wide or preventing your opponent from having the resources in order to continue their turn. I think there are components of every single class that play towards a tempo strategy. On top of the Frostbites, you also have components like freezing Arsenal or freezing allies, or preventing your opponents from being able to draw or reveal cards in the form of Channel to Bleak Expanse. Then you also have block cards like Crumble to Eternity, which interacts with your opponent's equipment, basically preventing them from getting the full block value on an equipment. In addition, Crumble to Eternity has the component where it gives your next attack Dominate. As a tempo plan, Dominate prevents you from being able to block optimally and increases the chances that you're going to get your on-hits. Dominate is one of the key, aspects, or one of the key design principles Ice has access to. And actually, if you look at Bravo Star of the Show, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about the card is that his essence of Earth, Ice, and Lightning, those effects are basically presented in that order for his ability. So if you reveal an Earth card, your next action card with cost 3 or greater gets +2. If you've revealed an Ice card, it gets Dominate. And if you've revealed a Lightning card, it gets Go Again. Now you have to reveal all 3 elements at the start of your turn. However, the order kind of tells you how each of the talents are benefiting his next attack action card. With that being said, if we look at Icelander Stormbind and we look at her hero ability, we can kind of see how the essence of ice affects her ability to play the game, or how it rather augments her wizard class. So the wizard component, I would say, is the first part of her hero ability, where it says you can play a blue non-attack action card from your arsenal as an instant if it's not your turn. And then her ice component, the part that basically makes her feel like an ice wizard, is the part that says when you play an ice card during your opponent's turn, create a frostbite token under their control. And so basically she has this access to Storm Striders as a wizard, but then whenever she plays those ice action cards on her opponent's turn, she's creating that frostbite, which is slowing them down, preventing them from being able to play what they want to play. And the fact that arcane damage often requires arcane barrier. Pitching your resources in order to prevent the damage basically means that she's taxing her opponent's resources in multiple ways. 1 with the arcane damage and 2 with the frostbite. Even though she's playing these below rate arcane spells, coming in blue, she's also given this weapon in the form of Waning Moon to supplement those damage numbers. So, for instance, if she has an Ether Hail in her arsenal and she plays that on her opponent's turn, she's not only getting the 2 arcane damage, she's also generating the frostbite, and she's also able to follow that up off of the pitch card in order to deal an extra 3 damage. So if she prevents a go wide opponent from getting off an extra head jab, let's say, that adds even more value. And if the opponent saves their resources in order to try to continue their turn, it just means that Iyslander is able to walk her opponents down and deal more damage. So there's this trade-off between how much arcane damage do you want to prevent, and are you okay being limited to the number of action points you're using in a turn, given that she's creating these frostbites that are going to happen typically in the middle of your turn. And so absolutely, I think the ice talent really does add this kind of tempo flavor to many heroes, or at least if it's not a tempo component, it's a control component, where you're preventing your opponent from doing what they want to do. You're decelerating the pace of the game. That's kind of the gist of how Ice turns Iyslander into a more tempo-oriented hero. I mean, in my video, I talked about Stormstriders being, a snatch or a tool that helps wizards end the game a turn earlier. And Iyslander has even more range off of Stormstriders. For instance, if she had an Emeritus Scolding in hand, an Aether Hail, an Arsenal, a Waning Moon, she could play all of those cards after her opponent's tapped out of resources to end the game from a further distance than Kano typically can, unless he's set up this massive combo turn. So that's kind of what I have to say about Iyslander. But yes, 100%. Ice kind of puts these heroes in a more controlling or a more tempo-oriented game plan than they would be otherwise. With Kano, you're basically trying to just prevent the damage, where versus Iyslander, you're also trying to get around this disruption. So 100% agree there. I just had to cut that out because the video was getting too long. If you look at the Ice Fusion cards that she can play as a wizard, as well as her specializations from Uprising, you can see that there's this controlling element that prevents the opponent from having full access to their resources or having full access to their cards, which are both very strong tempo tools in Flesh and Blood. You can see that with Aether Ice Vein, they have to pay 2 resources if it deals any damage whatsoever, whereas with Brain Freeze, you get to look at their hand and then put an action card that costs 0 onto the top of their deck. Very similar to Oldhim's Ice Reaction, except it has to be that 0 cost. Then when you look at her specializations in the form of Ice Eternal and Frost Hex, you see that she's creating this board state of Frostbite tokens. She's doing this wizard thing of creating these giant combo turns, but the combo comes in the form of Frostbites, basically stopping the opponent's turn right in its tracks. And then if Iyslander's been able to get Frost Hexes onto her opponent's side of the board, she's created all of these Frostbites, and each one of them is going to deal 1 arcane damage to the opposing hero at the end of their turn for each Frost Hex. And so, rather than having this Aether Wildfire combo, she has this Ice Eternal Frost Hex combo that plays very similarly in the total amount of damage it does, but it's doing it in a way that also stops the opponent from being able to carry out their turn in an optimal or an efficient way. So moving on to Lucas Fanti, he's an assassin OTP and always felt wrong when people called Slippy an aggro deck because it's a tempo deck, and I would completely agree with that. I think it was in my which Flesh and Blood hero should you play when I was looking at the assassin heroes, and I was talking about how Slippy was a Rushdown hero when you compare Slippy to Huntsman or you compare Slippy to New. And so when you look at the Rushdown versus the tempo heroes, both prefer going second because they're trying to gain tempo. In the case of Rushdown heroes, they're trying to gain tempo by forcing opponents to block and give up cards from hand, whereas tempo heroes prefer to go second as well, but they're doing it because they're trying to force opponents to block with these negative on-hit effects. However, Rushdown and tempo heroes are different in the fact that Rushdown heroes try to accelerate the game by getting extra value for themselves, whereas tempo heroes try to decelerate their opponent's game plan. The other thing that I think really differentiates them is what their hand structure looks like. A Rushdown hero, there's kind of this common saying that if you're in a Rushdown race or an aggro race, the aggro deck that has to block first is the deck that loses because they've suddenly lost the tempo because their cards are so synergistic. They gain more value when they're combined together, whereas with a tempo hero, even if it's a tempo hero like Slippy is okay when they have to block giving a couple cards up because their hands just don't scale in the same way that a Rushdown deck would do so. So for instance, with the Syndra hand, you see that with Mask of Momentum, Ancestral Empowerment as an attack reaction, and the fealty token being used, you can see that Syndra is able to get 25 value offensively if she's able to set up an arsenal and use the full 4-card hand with the card draws from the Mask of Momentum and the Ancestral Empowerment. Whereas if you then force the Syndra to be on the defense, if let's say they get down to 1 life point, they have to start blocking, they're only able to get 10 points of value defensively because those aggressive cards sacrifice that defensive value for more offensive prowess. Whereas if you take a look at an example Slippy hand, for instance, here, if Slippy has to block with all of these cards, they get a little bit more value than the Syndra. They get 11 points of value defensively if they're blocking with their whole hand, whereas they're not able to use that full hand offensively. So in this case, rather than attacking with the Infiltrate, we're just going to say we're going to attack with the Infect, because that's going to make it a little bit easier to calculate the value. But for instance, if Slippy attacks with the Infect, they'll get 3 points of value plus the Blood Rot, giving potentially extra 2 points of value. If Pain in the Backside hits, you have your Dagger doing an additional point of damage. And then you have Leave No Witnesses threatening an additional 4, plus losing the Arsenal, banishing the top card of deck. So if the opponent lets everything there hit, they're getting 13 plus points of value if you're adding in the Arsenal banish, the banish from the top of the deck, and then the chip damage from the Bloodrot Pox and the Hunter's Clave. However, if you combine the total value with the Infiltrate that they can't necessarily use, they're okay to block with some cards from hand. So I guess the difference between a tempo deck and a Rushdown deck is that a tempo deck isn't as committed to going in on full offense that the Rushdown hero is. They're more capable of blocking with 1, 2, sometimes even 3 cards, depending on the tempo hero, and then sending back still good amounts of damage. So I think if you are trying to evaluate whether a hero with Go Again is a tempo hero or a Rushdown hero, just looking at how the cards scale. Are multiple attacks on the combat chain getting stronger and stronger because of how you're presenting them, or are they kind of all standalone? And if we look at this triangle with Rushdown, Control, and Setup, tempo decks fall somewhere in between a Rushdown and a Control deck because they're still aggressive, they're still dealing damage to the opponent on a turn-to-turn basis, but they have these deleterious on-hit effects that Control decks do. But I do think that with Arachne Slip Through the Cracks, one of the potential problems, or maybe one of the confusions that some people have in calling them an aggro deck or a Rushdown deck, is that Go Again keyword. But if you look at Lexi Livewire, who is also a tempo hero and was one of the biggest meta threats when she was at her strongest before she hit Living Legend, the fact that she was able to give her arrow attacks Go Again while also providing these arrow on-hit effects was something that was really difficult to manage, and she was so strong because of that. The other tempo hero that I do want to point out that had access to Go Again is Starvo. And so if we look at all of these heroes that are kind of seen not necessarily as broken, but they're seen as these oppressive powerhouses that shut down a lot of decks, it's because they have the Go Again capabilities of Rushdown heroes, not to the exact same degree as a Rushdown hero, but the impact of those on-hit effects really make them difficult to deal with. And so I think, for LSS, if they're designing these tempo decks, one of the things that they have to be careful about when designing is they're not giving them too free access to Go Again along with these disruptive on-hit effects. Lucas also had another point that I wanted to talk about, which is that tempo is a well-established term in other TCGs, basically means how efficient the use of resources is, saying a tempo play is a play that lets the minimum amount of resources go to waste, whereas in Flesh and Blood, the resource is cards. So the player that has the tempo of the match is the player that gets to utilize their cards in the most optimal way, usually offensively. And I agree with that. I think in other games, when you have things like mana or lands or energy or whatever those resources are, those typically are refreshing, and you're typically putting those on the board or on your creatures or whatnot, depending on how the game is designed. Whereas, in Flesh and Blood, your resources are your hand. So whether that is to block, whether that is to attack, whether that is to set up for a future turn, if we look at this example hand that's pretty straightforward with the 0 to 60, a zipper hit, a throttle, and a Teklo core, this hand can be used in a number of different ways, but the unique part about Flesh and Blood is rather than drawing one card per turn, you're drawing 4 new cards every single turn. And it's up to you as the player to figure out how you're going to allocate those resources. If I'm looking at this hand, there's so many different ways I can play it. I could block 6 with the zipper hit and the throttle, and I could set up a Teklo core and I could arsenal the 0 to 60. In other matchups where maybe my opponent is at a low life total, maybe I don't need to worry about setting up the Teklo core. So maybe instead I pitch that to play the throttle, the zipper hit, and then the 0 to 60. With the way that the hands are designed, a tempo hero or a tempo play is going to be a play that prevents me from playing out my resources in an optimal way. Because there's just so many different ways to play your hand, the way that tempo ends up looking like is attacking your opponent's hand a lot of the time. So I guess going along with the mechanologist theme here, one of the important points I want to talk about is that tempo isn't just your hand, although your hand is the primary way to control or take tempo. Whereas with mechanologists, they have these items that they're putting into the arena that are these temporary advantages. For instance, you could set up a boom grenade, choose not to crank it, and then your opponent says, oh, next turn my opponent is really going to try to deal extra damage. They also have cards like Cerebellum Processor that says I can trade action points to draw an extra card, which when you're dealing with 4-card hands every single turn can be a huge advantage later on in the game. Simultaneously, while Boom Grenade and Cerebellum Processor can provide a lot of damage, you also have cards like Null Time Zone that are able to decelerate the opponent by preventing them from pitching or playing cards from hand. And so all 3 of these cards, I think, can also be seen as tempo tools, right? Boom Grenade accelerating the game, Cerebellum Processor giving you extra cards, Null Time Zone decelerating your opponent, preventing them from being able to play their hand optimally. But it's basically anything that can affect the board state. So that also looks like things like auras. In the case of Guardians, they use these seismic surges to transfer resources in between turns. So they say, if I have extra resources on this turn, I can create seismic surges and put those resource points into a future turn. Whereas Rune Blades can say, well, I'm going to create these rune chant tokens and transfer damage to a future attack or add damage to a future attack. And I think one of the most interesting examples in a fairly new hero is Fang and his fealty tokens. And so with the fealty tokens, once Fang gets 3 of those, his dagger attacks cost 1 less resource to activate. And so Fang basically is creating this board state of fealty tokens that let him essentially level up and gain that hero ability once he hits that board state. That being said, there's also ways to interact with each of these things. You can destroy those token auras in a number of different ways. Another thing that's kind of related that I want to talk about as well are illusionist phantasm attacks as well as illusionist spectra auras. So if we look at, for instance, Herald of Erudition, you see that it has a really powerful Snatch-like effect where if it hits, it goes into your hero's soul and you draw 2 cards, which is incredibly powerful. It also has Dominate, which means your opponent either has to give up a 3 block and armor, or they have this option of blocking it with a non-illusionist attack action card that has 6 or more power. And so when you look at Phantasm is essentially encouraging your opponent to lose their strongest attacks in order to prevent the heralds from hitting. So when you look at Herald of Erudition or any Phantasm attack, that attack is essentially encouraging your opponent to block it with their strongest attack, making their following turn weaker. And I think even though we don't really think about it as a tempo tool in this way, it's a tool that makes your opponent go on the back foot by providing these attacks. Normally, a yellow 2 for 5 that draws 2 cards, that's incredibly powerful, but it encourages your opponent to play go tall attacks. So the heralds basically kind of counter, in a way, I guess, the go wide strategies, because the power of those attacks typically aren't more than 3 or 4 points of damage. Whereas on the other hand, you have Spectra auras, which really do the opposite. While Herald of Erudition struggles against heroes that have big go tall attacks, those same heroes really struggle against decks with cards like Passing Mirage, where they're not able to use multiple action points to try to threaten the illusionist's hand while still controlling the board state. You used to see this a lot in the OG Prism matchup versus Bravo is Bravo would do well against the Heralds, but they would have to run basically a fully dedicated go wide sideboard with cards like Zealous Belting, Rouse the Ancients, Outmuscle, those kinds of attacks to try to still threaten Prism while also being able to then pitch into Nothos to try to take out the Passing Mirage. And so one of the things that I think is so interesting about the Illusionist class, even though I don't necessarily play it a ton, is the fact that they have these tools that can gain the Illusionist tempo. So against, go wide decks, you have these Herald attacks that counter the go wide strategies, whereas against the go tall strategies, you have the Passing Mirage that really taxes them for not having a ton of access to go again in order to take those auras out. In kind of a similar vein, I think Gravy Bones, his allies really play a similar role in the tempo game. If we look at basically how efficient a hero is able to take out an ally, take for instance Limpet Hopalong, the fact that she only has 1 point of life and continually is able to attack for 2 go again. Let's say you're a Guardian and you have a hammer that costs you 3 resources and you are also kind of taxed on action points, it's going to be really hard to efficiently clear Limpet Hopalong. Whereas if you are, say a ninja like Katsu, all you need to do is pitch 1 resource into Kadachi in order to take out the Limpet Hopalong. Whereas on the other hand, kind of in the same vein, if you have Whaler Humperdinck on the board and it's this huge ally that's got 11 power and 7 life, if you're a go wide deck, you're going to struggle to deal enough points of damage in order to take out the Whaler Humperdinck without giving up 2 or 3 cards. Whereas, Guardian might be able to send a Choke Slam into the Humperdinck in order to deal enough points of damage to take it out. And so with these ally or these board-based decks, one of the things that I didn't really talk about in the video that I wanted to bring up now is the fact that these board-based heroes are able to set up their board states in ways that prevent the opponents from getting efficient use of their hand by playing these allies that will accrue more and more value every turn. And even if they're targeted, your opponent's basically lost tempo by having to target them and deal damage in an inefficient way. And then you have these allies that are kind of these utility pieces like Sawbones and preventing 1 damage that would be dealt at instant speed. If you thought you were able to take out Whaler Humperdinck with efficient damage, Sawbones just being on the board says, hey, you have to actually reconsider that and rethink how much damage. And so as you are looking at these board-based heroes, whether that's playing them or playing against them, it's really important to think about how putting these allies onto the board puts your opponent in this situation where they have to give up tempo to either clear it or they're losing tempo by continuing to take damage from them. If you have an opponent that just keeps ignoring Sawbones and doesn't attack, you're able to deal 6 damage every single turn. And so it's one of those things that I think is really important to keep in mind. And then the last thing, which kind of ties into this like acceleration and deceleration component, is that a lot of parts of Flesh and Blood, with it being such an interactive game, is that you have these cards that interact with various components. And I think LSS has done a phenomenal job at making classes have specific board state targets. For instance, Brutes basically being the opposite of Mechanologists, being against these items. And so having cards like Arg Smash or Smashing Performance, helping them to basically take out the technology or taking out the items while still doing damage. I mean, Smashing Performance gets so much better as a card if you're playing against an opponent who is going to have items on the board. On the other hand, you have Wizards who are the strongest magic users. And so they're able to destroy these auras and aura tokens and still deal damage to their opponent while destroying that board state of auras. I mean, if you've ever played a Runeblade into a wizard, or even, let's take the previous example of Fang. Say you're a Fang with a board state of fealty tokens. All a wizard has to do is play a Scour, pitching 3 resources in order to turn the Fang offline and forcing them to completely redo their quest of getting that board state of 3 fealty tokens. And then one of the things that they've been doing in the case of Midas Touch is giving these board state interactive tools that are generic as opposed to class-based. If you have a hero that struggles into heroes like Gravy Bones, you can say, okay, well, maybe it's worth it for me to run Midas Touch So I can destroy the Whaler Humperdinck at the cost of 1 resource and then continue my turn. If you are playing one of these heroes and you notice that you're struggling against a hero that has a board state, it's worthwhile trying to see if your class or if the generic tools have these tools that help you interact with their board state in a way that helps you regain some of the tempo that you otherwise would have lost. Another question or another comment that I had was from Ener Anna, who said, I wanted to expand on how cards in your hand are tempo with how other classes strip cards from their opponents, with life being a resource. 4 damage is not a lot, but if you're at 1, you need to block all of it. That means you're spending 2 cards for their 1, which bolsters the point that the cards in your hand are tempo. And I completely agree on that point as well. I mean, if you look at Snatch, it coming in red, yellow, and blue, pretty much only the red is ever really played for that same reason, is that, even if you're not at 1 life point, the fact that your opponent typically has to give up 2 cards unless they have a 4 block D-react or a block card that defends 4, they're going to have to give up multiple cards, whereas yellow Snatch is almost never used because most cards in the game at this point block for 3. And so it's really about making your opponent give up more cards from hand or make them give up more resources in order to stop what you're trying to do. And so if we go back to the low life threshold point, I'm sure most people have heard of being Kodachi locked, where you never want to get to 1 life point because your opponent can basically attack you with 2 harmonized Kodachis, making you give up 2 cards from hand with a single pitch card and basically putting you into the danger zone at that point. Whereas against brutes, you always want to make sure that you never go below 2, maybe 4 damage if you think your opponent has 2 reckless swings. In the case of reckless swing, that provides another threshold that players need to really be mindful of. Similar to Kodachi lock, it basically tells your opponent that you can't go below 2 or 4 life, or you're at risk of losing to a reckless swing. And then I think one of the bigger examples of this card is Guardian and their big dominate attacks like Macho Grande. Because you're only able to block with 1 card from hand, it really says if you're playing against a Guardian, you need to keep your life totals as high as possible to avoid being in a Macho Grande kill range. I guess the extreme example of this is actually probably Kano with his Blazing Ether, where against a Kano, you could be at 30 plus life, and if you get hit by an Aether Wildfire into all these other arcane spells that are being pumped by that Aether Wildfire, and then Kano finishing off with the Blazing Ether, you really have to play in a way that avoids taking that damage. Otherwise, Kano's cards just get more and more effective the more arcane damage that's been done in a single turn. And so I think all 4 of those cards, the Kodachi, the Reckless Swing, the Macho Grande, and then just playing against Kano with Blazing Ether, these are all, I think, really key examples of where you're able to make your opponent give you cards that they may not otherwise give you if you didn't have those tools available to you. And so I think as a Flesh and Blood player, as you get better and better at the game, one of the things that you pick up is how low can I go? Like, at what life threshold am I going to lose more and more cards because I need to avoid getting to a certain life total threshold, and how badly does that need to happen? Against Kano, if I don't have Arcane Barrier, I need to try to end the game as soon as possible. Whereas if I'm playing a little bit more carefully, if I'm respecting wizards a little bit more, if I'm running AB3, you need to kind of know how much damage your opponent can deal to you, and especially for the heroes that can do it on your own turn, like Kano, like brutes. And this kind of, I think, goes along with what Pedro had said, which was, I don't know if I would call Toxicity a CNC. It's just a lot of damage, so it's more of a Rushdown or a Snatch card. And I think that, because of the way Flesh and Blood is designed, the only way to win a game besides Regicide is to take your opponent's life total down to 0. Basically, they need a way to deal more damage than the opponent can block. And so, at, let's say, 7 life to 40 life, Toxicity is, I would agree with you that a Toxicity is a Snatch card. It's helping you to reduce their life point totals faster than they can reduce yours. A 1 card 5 is an incredible point. But if you're at 6 life and below, I would say it acts like a command and conquer in the fact that it makes your opponent have to block in ways that they might otherwise not, because they can't afford to take even a single point of damage from that attack action. Otherwise, they're going to take a massive amount of damage that is going to end the game otherwise. And so like the Kodachi, be like the Reckless Swing, the Toxicity makes it so that your opponent has to slow down. But like most things in Flesh and Blood, I guess the short answer is just that it depends, on the context of the game, which heroes are playing each other, what their life totals are, etc. Yeah, I guess going back to the life threshold point, I mean, if you think about Guardians, in addition to Macho Grande, they have cards like Terra Sunder and Tuanothos, where you have to respect their second cycle with Terra Sunder for 7 dominate on their weapon swing. On hit, discard 2 cards. You have to respect Dash.io's Boom Grenade off the top. You can't go to 5 life, or else you are forced to block every single card as long as they have Boom Grenades left in the deck. We talked about Reckless Swing before, but then another example that I think is really important, and with Riptide being in this Ranger class, the fact that his traps, when they're triggered, deal 1 damage to the attacking hero means that damage isn't really easily blockable. And so you have to make sure that your life total is high enough in order to avoid his single damage pings, which can oftentimes be for lethal on your own turn against the Riptide. So another comment that I got from Ener Anna is about pitching, tucking, and discarding, and how all of those fall into the same category. The only difference between them is if they can come back. Felling is a great tempo play, but not the best for super long games since that card is playable later. Other cards like Frostfang do something similar. Lastly, there's Intimidate. Since you're getting those cards back, you can still potentially send back a pretty big turn depending on your deck. However, unless you're sending brute numbers, your life total is going down to the point where you're forced to block. And that's something that I kind of wanted to talk about, but there wasn't really a good spot to talk about in my previous video. So I kind of have these cards ordered in, from left to right, from least disruptive to most disruptive. And, like most things, it depends on who you're playing and what your deck looks like. But, paying a resource instead of having to discard a card is pretty nice because you can get that card back. Whereas with Felling of the Crown, it prevents you from being able to defend with that card during that turn, so it acts as kind of a form of pseudo-evasion, but if your opponent is able to survive and keep their life totals high enough, that card can lose steam later on in the game. Whereas with Crippling Crush, discarding cards can be incredibly powerful, but then you have cards can bring them back, like Remembrance, or maybe you're playing a Crippling Crush into a Gravy Bones and they're able to discard allies, whereas with most heroes, banishing them is actually going to be the strongest form of disruption unless they're another shadow hero. So when you look at this, there's kind of a range, these levers of power that LSS and the developers can use in order to make a card stronger or weaker. So you could imagine, if Felling of the Crown did the same amount of damage but discarded instead of bottomed the cards from the deck, you could imagine that would be even stronger. Or you could say, if it made the hero pay a resource, even though it wouldn't really feel like an earth card at that point, it wouldn't be as strong as it is there. So you could imagine trying to shift the level of disruption on these cards up or down some. And I think that Intimidate falls on a similar spectrum. You get the cards back, so it's not as strong as completely bottoming the card, but the fact that it's random can really affect your opponent's turn. And if you're at a really low life total, you have to block it. If you look at these super fatiguey control-y decks, one of the heroes that they constantly struggle against is Rhinar, because he has this ability to strip these big defense reactions out of hand, or take the one resource card that they might have needed, or force them to block with that resource card. And so Intimidate is definitely, I think, a tempo tool, but much like the other components, it all kind of depends on what state of the game you're in. Like, I remember this one game that I played during the calling in Baltimore, and I was playing against this Leviah, and the Leviah was pitch stacking barraging beatdowns, and I got hit with like triple or quadruple barraging beatdown into a club attack, and that club attack was coming in for insane amounts of damage, but I wasn't expecting that. The barraging beatdowns acted like these pseudo-dominate components when they were all combined together. And so it's one of those things where it's all game state dependent. And, because of how interactive Flesh and Blood is as a card game, in certain matchups, you may want to block with the barraging beatdown because you don't have the space in order to set up that, triple barraging beatdown. Whereas in other cases, you may want to pitch stack and create this, this combo turn of barraging beatdowns that can get over your opponent's blocks. And, when you combine a barraging beatdown with an alpha rampage for Rhinar, and you play the barraging beatdown, you play the alpha rampage, you discard a random card. If that card is a 6 or more power attack, you've now intimidated 3 cards out of the opponent's hands. So unless they have a defense reaction in their arsenal, they're not able to reduce that attack. So you're essentially coming in for 13 damage, creating this offensive overlap that the opponent isn't able to out-defend. And so that's one of the tools that I think is really important to think about with a tempo hero or in any matchup is how are you or how is your opponent going to present damage in a way that's going to get over your opponent's blocking capabilities. And then for the last question or the last topic that I want to talk about, this is actually going to be something I talk about in my next video. So if you stuck around until this point, I want to thank you for watching this episode. The last question is about, deck classifications. What Einar Anna was saying is they came up with a handy deck classification system where heroes are classified on when they want to win the game, not necessarily how, going into, first, second, and third cycle and beyond. And then classifying decks based on how they want to close out the game with, Rushdown decks wanting to finish early, tempo decks finishing somewhere between early and mid-range finishing somewhere in the middle, mid and late being defensive, or late being fatigue decks. And I do think that this is a pretty good way to classify heroes, but I think that there's so much interaction and so much overlap between different types of decks that I actually started to create this system to help classify different decks. So I'm going to talk about this way more in my next video, but heroes can go from one side of the spectrum to the other based on the matchup, based on how you build them, etc. But some heroes are definitely more slanted in one direction or the other. So let's start out with the bottom, I guess the vertical axis, and we'll work from accelerating and go clockwise. So with the vertical axis or the vertical spectrum, you have accelerating to decelerating. So this is the Snatch versus CNC axis. Is your hero one that likes to present these threats over and over again? Are they heroes that, like in the Syndra example, where you're playing, a go again starter that gives your next attack +1? Are your attacks getting go again because of where they are in the combat chain? Or are you playing these cards that are decelerating your opponents, making them discard, making them pay resources, bottoming the cards, etc. So there's certain heroes that can definitely slide between accelerating or decelerating. Moving on to the next axis. So I talked a lot about tempo in my previous video, but kind of based on the comments that I talked about today, as well as some of the stuff that we talked about in the Everything You Need to Know About Tempo video, is I think when it comes down to Flesh and Blood, tempo is board presence, but it's also the quality of hand-to-hand plays, whether that be making your hand deal more damage than your opponent by accelerating that, or whether you're disrupting your opponent's hand. Are you playing so that their within turn cycle plays are lower quality than yours? Whereas if you're playing a fatigue strategy, you're saying the overall quality of the cards in my deck are greater than yours. And so I may have weaker cards within an individual turn cycle, but if I'm pitching my Terra Sunder to swing my Anothos for 4, I'm still getting good value. And when I come around to second cycle and I'm able to play that card, I'm able to get more overall value out of the cards from my deck than you might be if you're playing towards a tempo game plan where you're focusing on an individual hand or your hand plus an arsenal. And then lastly, we have the linear value versus the multiplicative value axis, where a linear value might say, well, my cards are worth 3, maybe 4 value each, but they don't scale much more than that. If I have 4 0 to 60s, let's say they're all red, my 4 0 to 60s are going to do 4 damage each. Whereas, if I have a multiplicative value deck, I have cards that are going to synergize with the other cards. So, let's say I have a maximum velocity and I have a way to get 2 extra resources. Let's say I have 3 0 to 60s and a Teklo core on the board. I'm able to send 4, 8, 12, 22 damage, which is a lot more than the 16 I would from the more linear value. And so, like the other axes or the other spectrums, if you want to call them that, you have this range where you can play where every card is worth about the same amount of value, but you can have these cards that provide this multiplicative value or this combo value. If you think about Brutes and Blood Rush Bellows, or if you think about High Octane, even Ether Wildfire or Aurora's Arc Lightning, all of those cards get more and more value the more cards are played with them. And so when we look at this last axis, because in Flesh and Blood there isn't really a combo deck, there are cards that combo off each other, it really comes down to, are most of the cards linear in value, or do you have these key essential pieces that are getting you this multiplicative value? I guess I should say before I move on to the next part, the way that I've laid out these axes is so that when you combine each three of these, where do they fall on, the accelerating versus decelerating, tempo versus fatigue, linear versus multiplicative axes. When you look at all of those and you look at the combination of where your hero falls on each of these axes, are they, a rushdown hero in the bottom left? Are they a control hero at the top? Or are they a setup hero in the bottom right? And so, if we look at Syndra, for instance, she's a hero that wants to accelerate the game. She's a hero that plays towards, having good quality hands. And even though she has these really strong power turns, most of her cards are pretty similar in that they're 3 power attacks with Go Again. She does have some cards that can help her multiply her value with, Mask of Momentum, with Wrath of Retribution. She has a number of cards that can do that, but for the most part, she doesn't have these key critical combo cards that are just letting her go and get insanely high numbers over the 3 to 4 points of value per card. On the other hand, if we look at Jarl, similar to Syndra, Jarl has linear value cards. He's not getting some insane combo off that just does more damage than typically allowed in Flesh and Blood. However, rather than being accelerating like Syndra, Jarl is decelerating with his ice cards, preventing efficient use of resources, taxing those resources with frostbites, destroying equipment with Mangle or Crumble to Eternity, and then rather than playing to the individual hand-to-hand plays, rather than playing on that game plan that requires him to keep tempo, he's able to play a deck quality game plan where he is trying to fatigue the opponent or say, at the end of the day, the quality of my cards are greater than yours, especially if I'm pitching a blue to play a 3 for 7 attack. Or if I have a Seismic Surge and I'm sending a 4 for 8 that has a crush effect. All of those components make Jarl play on a more controlling axis than, say a Rushdown axis, putting him at the top in the control spectrum. Whereas you have a hero like Kano, and Kano is accelerating like Syndra. He's not necessarily trying to fatigue, but he's saying the quality of the cards in my deck are better than the quality of cards in other decks, especially because of how they multiply the value of each other. I know we've talked about Aether Wildfire so much on today's episode, but an Aether Wildfire into all these other spells off the top, especially when you have these potions on the board, etc., really allow him to deal far more damage than most heroes are allowed to do in a single turn. Kano is trying to get to his combo as fast as possible. While Syndra and Jarl both got more linear value, Kano is on the extreme opposite of the spectrum, getting multiplicative value with his Aether Wildfire, Blazing Ether combos, and playing all of these arcane spells off the top of his deck by pitching blues with his energy potions. And so Kano is able to make his cards worth way more as a combination with that multiplicative value, basically giving him an overall higher deck quality, even if the individual cards on their own aren't the value that he's able to get out of them, especially in a single turn, are far more than most other heroes are able to get in the game. And so that puts him more in the setup category where he is trying to get that board state out of potions so that he can play Aether Wildfire combo in order to, most of the time, OTK his opponents. So with that being said, I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. I hope that this episode was helpful to you all. I hope that you found it enjoyable. If you do want to support the channel, if you want to make sure that you get your questions on the next episode when I do talk about the different types of deck classifications, if you have comments on the deck classification system that I just talked about, definitely let me know in the comments if you can. I would really appreciate your support over on Patreon or as a YouTube member. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll teach you in the next one.